The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft amber glow across the winding road. The streets were unusually quiet, with only the hum of Michael Jordan's sleek black Ferrari breaking the silence. Inside the car, the basketball legend was at ease, enjoying a rare moment of solitude. The day had been filled with smiles and handshakes at a charity gala. His presence raising funds for underprivileged youth. Now, with the event behind him, Michael welcomed the calm. The leather interior of the Ferrari cradled him like a throne. A testament to his hard-earned success. He glanced at the dashboard, the soft glow of the controls a comforting reminder of how far he had come. The road stretched ahead, empty and inviting. Then it happened. Red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, cutting through the serenity like a knife. The piercing wail of a siren followed, its urgency impossible to ignore. Michael's hands instinctively gripped the wheel tighter as his pulse quickened. What was this about? He hadn't been speeding, hadn't broken any laws. Stay calm, he muttered to himself. Pulling over to the side of the road. The Ferrari came to a smooth stop, its engine purring softly before he turned it off. Michael took a deep breath, his mind racing. A police cruiser stopped behind him, its lights painting the dark road in chaotic colors. The door opened, and a white officer stepped out. His posture was rigid. His hand resting conspicuously on his holstered gun. Michael rolled down the window, his movements deliberate and calm. Years of navigating public life had taught him the importance of composure. The officer approached, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the road. License and registration, the officer barked. His voice was sharp, laced with suspicion. Michael retrieved his documents from the glove compartment, moving slowly to avoid any misinterpretation. Of course, officer, he replied, his tone measured. May I ask why I've been stopped? The officer's eyes narrowed as he examined the documents, his gaze flicking between the papers and Michael's face. Step out of the car, he demanded abruptly, ignoring the question. Michael hesitated, his brow furrowing. Is there a problem? I don't understand. I said step out of the car, the officer barked, his voice rising. His hand shifted to rest on the grip of his gun. A surge of unease coursed through Michael. He'd heard stories like this, too many stories. Still, he complied, unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out of the car. The cool evening air hit him as he stood on the gravel shoulder, towering over the officer but making himself appear as non-threatening as possible. Hands where I can see them, the officer ordered. Michael raised his hands, his expression calm but questioning. Officer, I'd really like to know what this is about. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he began circling the car. His eye scanning every inch of the vehicle as if it held some dark secret. This your car? The officer asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. Yes, it is, Michael replied. Must be nice. The officer muttered, his words barely audible but no less cutting. He stopped and turned to Michael, his hand still on his gun. We got a call about a black man driving a car like this. Said he might be carrying drugs. You fit the description. Michael's heart sank. He'd anticipated this, had feared this, but it still hit like a punch to the gut. That's ridiculous, he said, keeping his voice steady. I've done nothing wrong. The officer smirked, his expression a mixture of disdain and power. We'll see about that. Hands on the hood. Michael complied, spreading his hands against the sleek, cold metal of the Ferrari's hood. The officer moved behind him, his hands rough and invasive as he patted Michael down. You athletes think you're untouchable. Don't you? The officer sneered. Flashing your money, your fame, like it makes you better than the rest of us. Michael clenched his jaw, biting back a response. He knew the game being played here. Any sign of defiance, any perceived challenge, could escalate this into something far worse. The officer finished the pat-down and stepped back. Pop the trunk, he ordered. Michael turned, his composure cracking slightly. You're searching my car now? Without probable cause? I am the probable cause, the officer shot back. Pop the trunk, or I'll do it myself. Michael took a deep breath and nodded, reaching for the keys in his pocket. He pressed the button, and the trunk clicked open. The officer wasted no time. He began rifling through Michael's belongings, tossing items onto the ground without care. A neatly packed gym bag was unzipped and emptied, its contents strewn across the gravel. Got something to hide, the officer taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. Figures. You people are all the same. Michael froze, the words cutting deeper than any physical blow. Excuse me? He said, his voice low. You heard me, the officer continued, his tone venomous. You think you belong here? Driving a car like this? You don't. You and your kind are a stain on this country. Always playing the victim, always looking for handouts. You ruin everything you touch. Michael felt a surge of anger rise within him, hot and undeniable. But he forced it down. His years of discipline taking over. He knew this wasn't about truth or justice. It was about control, about power. The officer stepped back, his search yielding nothing. His frustration was evident. But it only seemed to fuel his anger. You think you're smart, don't you? The officer spat. You think being famous makes you untouchable? Let me tell you something, Jordan. Out here. You're just another black man. And you're lucky I haven't found anything yet. A few cars slowed as they passed, their occupants craning their necks to see what was happening. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene from a safe distance. Michael stood still, his hands by his sides, his breathing steady but his mind racing. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. Michael stood beside his car, his belongings scattered across the gravel like discarded debris. The officer, still searching for something to justify his actions, moved with deliberate sloppiness. Tearing through Michael's possessions. A gym bag lay open, its contents, a pair of basketball shoes, a neatly folded jersey, a water bottle, now spread haphazardly across the ground. The officer rummaged through them, his frustration growing with every passing moment. Nothing, the officer muttered under his breath, kicking one of the shoes aside. He straightened up and turned to Michael, his face twisted in a scowl. Guess you're better at hiding it than I thought. Michael met his gaze, calm but resolute. I told you, there's nothing to hide. I don't know who gave you that tip, but they were wrong. Wrong? The officer's voice was a growl now, filled with venom. Let me tell you something, boy. People like you are never innocent. You just get better at covering your tracks. Don't think your fame gives you a free pass. You're not special, you're just another thug in a fancy car. Michael's chest tightened. The words hitting him like blows. He had spent his entire life rising above prejudice, proving his worth through sheer talent, discipline, and character. Yet here he was. Reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of someone who had never seen him beyond the color of his skin. The officer stepped closer, invading Michael's personal space. His hand rested on his holstered gun. The gesture deliberate, a silent reminder of the imbalance of power. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue, the officer sneered. Not so tough without your fans cheering, huh? Or maybe you're just trying to act calm while you figure out how to weasel your way out of this. Michael took a slow, measured breath, his mind racing to maintain control. I'm cooperating, officer. He said evenly. But I won't stand here and let you insult me. I deserve respect, just like anyone else. The officer laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed in the empty night. Respect? From me? You're dreaming. You people don't deserve respect. You ruin everything you touch, our neighborhoods, our schools, our society. You're nothing but a parasite, living off what others build. Michael's fists clenched at his sides, his patience wearing thin. He had heard these words before, from others who hid their hatred behind badges or authority. But hearing them now, in such an overt and cruel manner, ignited a fire within him. More cars began to slow as they passed, drivers curious about the commotion. Some rolled down their windows. Their phones pointed in Michael's direction. The officer noticed the growing attention and seemed to thrive on it, his posture becoming more aggressive, his voice louder. "You think you're untouchable because you can dribble a ball and dunk," the officer shouted, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "You think that makes you better than the rest of us? Let me tell you something, Jordan. Out here, you're nobody. Just another black man in a world that's too good for you." The crowd murmured, their shock palpable. A few people yelled out in protest. But the officer ignored them. Michael's face remained stoic, but inside, he was seething. The officer returned to the car, his search becoming more frantic. He opened the glove compartment, yanking out papers and tossing them aside. He checked under the seats, behind the dashboard, even in the tiny compartments meant for coins. Still, he found nothing. Michael stood silently, his breath steady but his heart pounding. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but he knew it wouldn't matter. To this officer, he was guilty by default, a target of misplaced rage and prejudice. "You're lucky," the officer finally said, slamming the car door shut. "Lucky I haven't found anything yet. But don't think this is over." He stepped closer to Michael again, his face inches away. "You're not fooling anyone. I know your type. Always acting innocent, always crying racism whenever someone calls you out. But deep down, you're all the same, liars, thieves, animals." The words stung like poison. Michael's hands twitched at his sides, his body urging him to act, to fight back. But he didn't. He couldn't. Any sign of resistance could end in tragedy. The officer leaned back, his expression triumphant. "Go ahead, keep playing the victim. That's all you people are good for. Victims and criminals. Society would be better off without you." The crowd was larger now, their voices growing louder. Some shouted in support of Michael, while others remained silent, recording the scene. The officer seemed to relish the attention, his authority emboldened by the lack of immediate consequences. Michael, however, saw an opportunity in the cameras. If nothing else, the world would see this. They would see the humiliation, the degradation, the blatant racism. The officer took one last look at the car, his frustration evident. "Clean this mess up," he snapped, gesturing to the scattered belongings. "And get the hell out of here. You're lucky I don't take you in just for wasting my time." Michael didn't move, his gaze fixed on the officer. "You're wrong," he said quietly but firmly. The officer frowned. "What did you say?" "You're wrong about me, about us," Michael continued, his voice steady. "We're not what you think. And no matter how hard you try to tear us down, we'll rise. Every time." The officer's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, the sound of another car approaching caught their attention. A second police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing. The door opened, and out stepped the police chief. The tension in the air shifted immediately. The officer straightened, his confidence faltering. Michael remained still, his eyes now focused on the new arrival. The chief, a tall, commanding African-American man, surveyed the scene with a sharp gaze. He took in the scattered belongings, the officer's defensive posture, and Michael's calm but defiant stance. "What's going on here?" the chief demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. The police chief stepped out of his cruiser, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel as he approached. His tall, imposing frame exuded authority, and his face bore the stern expression of someone accustomed to cutting through chaos. He stopped a few feet from Michael and the officer, his sharp eyes surveying the scene. "Officer Grant," the chief said, his voice calm but firm. "What exactly is happening here?" "Grant." The officer who had been tormenting Michael straightened up, his earlier bravado faltering. "Chief Harris, we received a tip about possible drug possession. This individual fit the description. So I stopped him and conducted a search. Harris glanced at the mess on the ground, the contents of Michael's gym bag strewn carelessly, papers fluttering in the light evening breeze. His gaze shifted to Michael, who stood tall despite the weight of the humiliation he had endured. "Did you find anything?" Harris asked, his tone flat and professional. "No, sir." Grant admitted begrudgingly, his face flushed with frustration. "Then why is Mr. Jordan's property scattered all over the ground?" Harris demanded, his voice gaining an edge. Grant hesitated, his earlier confidence crumbling. I was being thorough." Harris's jaw tightened. He turned to Michael, his expression softening slightly. "Mr. Jordan, I apologize for the treatment you've received tonight. I can assure you this is not how we operate under my watch." Michael nodded, his composure intact but his voice edged with exhaustion. "Thank you, Chief. But the damage is already done." The crowd of onlookers grew silent, their attention fixed on the unfolding drama. Some whispered among themselves, their phones capturing every moment. The chief seemed acutely aware of the audience and what this moment represented. "Officer Grant," Harris said, turning back to him. "Do you realize who you've stopped tonight? This man is a legend, an icon, and above all, a human being who deserves respect. Your behavior tonight was unacceptable." Grant bristled. "With all due respect, sir, I was following protocol. I had a tip, and I acted on it." "A tip? Or a bias?" Harris shot back, his tone razor-sharp. "Because from what I see here, you let your prejudice guide your actions. You had no cause to treat Mr. Jordan like a criminal." Grant opened his mouth to protest, but Harris raised a hand to silence him. "Enough. You've embarrassed yourself, this department, and this community." Michael spoke up then, his voice steady and resonant. "This isn't just about me, Chief. It's about everyone who faces this kind of treatment. The ones who don't have a platform or cameras to hold people accountable." Harris nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Jordan. And that's why we need to address this, publicly and transparently." He turned to the crowd, addressing them directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed tonight is not what law enforcement should represent. We are here to serve and protect, not to harass or humiliate. I assure you, there will be consequences for what has occurred here." The onlookers murmured in agreement, their earlier tension easing slightly. Harris faced Grant one last time. "I'm placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately. Hand me your badge and gun." Grant's face turned red with fury and humiliation. "Chief, you can't." "Now, Officer Grant." Harris interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Grant removed his badge and holstered weapon, handing them over with a glare that could burn steel. He shot a final, venomous look at Michael before turning and walking away. Michael watched him go, a mixture of relief and lingering anger coursing through him. He turned to Harris. "Thank you, Chief. But this won't change what happened tonight. Or the fact that it happens all the time." Harris nodded, his expression grave. "I know. And it's my responsibility to make sure it doesn't happen again. Would you be willing to work with us, Mr. Jordan? Help us address the systemic issues that lead to moments like this?" Michael paused, considering the weight of the request. Finally, he nodded. "If it means fewer people have to go through what I did tonight, I'm in." The chief extended a hand, and Michael shook it firmly. The crowd began to clap, the sound starting hesitantly but growing louder. It wasn't just applause for Michael, it was a demand for change, a call for accountability. As the chief helped Michael gather his belongings, the two men exchanged a look of mutual understanding. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but this moment was a step toward something better. As Michael got back into his car, he glanced at the crowd one last time. The cameras were still rolling, the faces still watching. He started the engine and drove away. The Ferrari's quiet hum a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded. Behind him, the night closed in. But Michael knew the conversation sparked tonight would carry on, a fire that refused to be extinguished. The next morning, Michael awoke to find his name dominating headlines, social media feeds, and news broadcasts. Footage of the encounter, captured from multiple angles by bystanders, had gone viral overnight. The stark imagery of him standing tall against the officer's demeaning tirade had struck a chord with millions. Phrases like #justice for Michael and #end racial profiling trended across platforms, with celebrities, activists, and ordinary citizens weighing in. Some praised Michael for his composure, while others condemned the officer's blatant prejudice. The incident had reignited a heated debate about racism, power, and justice in America. Michael sat in his living room, his phone buzzing relentlessly with calls and messages. His publicist, Denise, paced back and forth, rattling off updates. CNN wants an exclusive interview. ESPN wants you on their morning show. And the governor's office called, they want to issue a formal apology on behalf of the state, Denise said, her tone a mix of excitement and exasperation. Michael shook his head. This isn't about interviews or apologies, Denise. It's about change. Real change. If all this attention doesn't lead to action, then what's the point? Denise stopped pacing, her expression softening. You're right, Michael. But people are listening. You have a platform most people can only dream of. If you want change, now's the time to demand it. He nodded, her words sinking in. This wasn't just his fight, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been judged, mistreated, or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. Later that afternoon, Michael stood at a podium in front of a packed press conference. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for position, and a hushed anticipation filled the air. Last night, Michael began. His voice steady, I experienced something no one should ever have to endure. I was profiled, humiliated, and treated as less than human. Not because of what I did, but because of what I look like. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This isn't new. It didn't start last night, and it won't end unless we confront it head-on. Racism isn't just about individuals, it's about systems. Systems that allow prejudice to thrive, unchecked. Systems that fail to hold people accountable. That's what we need to change. The room erupted into applause, but Michael raised a hand to quiet them. I'm not here to be a victim. I'm here to be a voice. And I'm calling on everyone, leaders, citizens, and especially those in positions of power, to join me in this fight. Because it's not just my fight. It's ours. Meanwhile, Officer Grant sat alone in his modest home, the light from the TV casting harsh shadows across his face. Every channel seemed to replay the footage of the previous night. His words, so venomous, so unrestrained, echoed back at him. Now framed as the ultimate example of systemic racism. His phone buzzed incessantly, notifications of angry messages, calls, and emails piling up. Protesters had gathered outside his precinct, demanding his permanent dismissal and criminal charges. He downed the last of his beer, his hand trembling. A part of him wanted to defend his actions, to justify his behavior as part of the job. But deep down, another part, a quieter, guilt-ridden part, knew he had crossed a line. The knock at his door startled him. He opened it to find Chief Harris standing there, his expression unreadable. Chief, Grant began, his voice unsteady. Save it, Harris said, stepping inside. I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to tell you the truth. Grant stiffened. The truth? Yes. Harris said, his tone cold. The truth is, you let your hatred blind you. You abused your authority and disgraced this department. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Grant swallowed hard, his bravado gone. I made a mistake. No, Harris snapped. A mistake is forgetting to file a report or missing a detail. What you did was a choice, a deliberate, hateful choice. And it's not just your career that's on the line. It's your soul. The words hit Grant like a hammer. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet Harris's eyes. "I'll be recommending charges," Harris said. "But what happens next is up to you. You can keep denying, keep running, or you can face what you've done and try to make it right." Harris turned to leave but stopped at the door. "One more thing, this isn't just about you. It's about everyone who thinks like you, acts like you. If you want redemption, start by breaking that cycle." As the weeks passed, the incident continued to dominate public discourse. Protests erupted nationwide, demanding police reform and greater accountability. Legislators proposed new policies aimed at addressing racial profiling, and community leaders organized dialogues between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Michael, true to his word, became an active participant in the movement. He met with lawmakers, spoke at rallies, and partnered with organizations dedicated to combating systemic racism. His voice, once confined to the basketball court, now echoed through halls of power. Grant, meanwhile, faded from public view. Facing mounting pressure, he issued a public apology, acknowledging his actions and their impact. It wasn't enough to quell the anger, but it was a start, a small, uncertain step toward accountability. One evening, Michael stood on the balcony of his home, looking out at the city lights. The fight was far from over, but progress was being made. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope, not just for himself, but for a world that could one day be free of the hatred he had endured. As the wind rustled the trees below, Michael whispered to himself, "We rise." And rise they would. Together. Months had passed since that fateful night, but its ripple effects continued to shape conversations and actions across the nation. Michael Jordan, once known solely as a basketball icon, was now hailed as a leader in the fight against racial injustice. Yet, with every accolade and every step forward, Michael remained acutely aware of the weight of the journey ahead. The incident had led to tangible changes. New legislation aimed at curbing racial profiling had been introduced in several states, and departments across the country were rolling out mandatory anti-bias training programs. The court of public opinion had forced law enforcement agencies to confront their deep-seated issues. But the progress was not without resistance. One sunny afternoon, Michael found himself at a town hall meeting in Chicago. The auditorium buzzed with energy, filled with community members, activists, law enforcement officers, and policymakers. The air was thick with anticipation. Michael stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "It's not every day that we see a room like this, diverse in race, background, and perspective, coming together for a common purpose. That alone gives me hope." He glanced at the crowd, his gaze steady and sincere. But hope isn't enough. Change requires action, and action requires accountability. What happened to me was a symptom of a much larger problem, a system that has long prioritized power over people, control over compassion. A few heads nodded in agreement. "We can't fix this overnight," Michael continued. "But we can start. It begins with honest conversations like this one. It continues with reform, not just in policy, but in culture. And it ends when every person, regardless of the color of their skin, can feel safe and respected." The room erupted into applause, but Michael raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "I'm not asking for perfection," he said. "I'm asking for progress. For effort. For the courage to confront the uncomfortable truths that have shaped our society for far too long." In a corner of the room, Chief Harris listened intently. Since that night, he had become one of the most vocal advocates for reform within his department, working tirelessly to root out bias and rebuild trust with the community. But his journey had not been easy. he faced backlash from colleagues who resisted change and struggled to navigate the complexities of systemic racism. When the town hall concluded, Harris approached Michael, extending a hand. "Mr. Jordan," he said, his voice laced with respect. "Thank you for everything you're doing. It's making a difference." Michael shook his hand firmly. "And thank you for stepping up, Chief. Change starts with leaders like you." Harris hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said that night, about this being bigger than individuals. It's true. But individuals still matter. What you did, standing tall in the face of hate, it inspired me. And it's inspiring others, too." Michael smiled faintly. "One step at a time, Chief. That's how we win." Meanwhile, Officer Grant's life had taken a stark turn. After resigning from the force, he had disappeared from the public eye. But unbeknownst to many, he had sought therapy to confront the prejudice and anger that had fueled his actions. One day, Grant sent Michael a letter. "Dear Mr. Jordan, I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to say this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, not just to you but to everyone who has faced what you faced that night. I'm working on myself, trying to understand where my hatred came from and how I can unlearn it. I don't deserve your grace, but I hope my words can contribute, in some small way, to the change you're fighting for." Michael read the letter twice, his emotions a complex mix of anger, pity, and an unexpected glimmer of hope. He didn't respond immediately. But he kept the letter in his desk drawer, a reminder that even the most broken individuals could find a path to redemption. As the anniversary of the incident approached, a massive rally was organized in Chicago, drawing thousands of people from all walks of life. Michael was the keynote speaker, and as he stood on the grand stage overlooking the crowd, he felt the enormity of the moment. "We are not here to dwell on the past," Michael declared, his voice ringing out over the sea of faces. "We are here to build a future. A future where my story becomes a relic of history, not a recurring headline. A future where justice is not a privilege, but a right." The crowd erupted in cheers, their unity palpable. That night, as Michael returned home, he stood on his balcony, gazing at the city lights. He thought about how far he had come, not just as an athlete or a public figure, but as a man determined to leave the world better than he found it. The journey was far from over, but Michael knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice was worth every step, every sacrifice. The wind carried his whispered words into the night: "We rise together." And rise they did.